So it's important to understand the notion of heritability. It's pretty easy to document the influence of genes on variability in physical characteristics like eye color and hair curliness and all of that kind of thing. But explaining human behavior in terms of genes is more important, simply because human behavior is so complex, much more complex than physical characteristics, which frankly are complex enough themselves. No behavior can be explained in terms of different alleles of a single gene. It just doesn't work that way. We're too complex. So before looking for gene alleles that might help explain our variability in behavior, I think we first need to find evidence that genes are involved in behavior at all. This usually means demonstrating some kind of what we call heritability, that is, the proportion of variability in some characteristics in the population that's likely to be due to genetic variability rather than differences in environment. So in other words, what is caused by our genes versus what's caused by our environment and learning. So these estimates are often made by comparing the extent of the phenotype similarity in identical twins raised together versus those adopted and raised apart. So you can imagine identical twins have the same DNA for all intents and purposes, but if they're raised apart, then they should have some pretty different environmental characteristics, right? They should have different learning, stress to different things, and so forth. So heritability in this case is really equal to the variability between those two individuals that are due to genetic differences divided by the total variability in the population. So examples of studies like these suggest that about 40% of the population variability in shyness, for example, right, a behavioral trait, can be explained in terms of genetic differences. So you can see that there's a fair amount that's explained not in terms of genetic differences, but of course in terms of environment and learning. But certainly genetics plays a part. On the other hand, these studies can be a bit controversial because families often must be screened pretty rigorously before they're allowed to adopt, and that leads to them being somewhat more uniform than the population at large. There's a reduction in variability of the environment. People may be raised in somewhat similar environments, usually environments with adoption that perhaps has a little bit more affluence than average, and so on. So that might mean that such studies may underestimate the influence of the environment. Another important actually complication of all of this is that genetic and environmental influences aren't separate, as we alluded to before. So the field that studies that intersection or that interaction is called epigenetics. Epigenetics studies the way genes and the environment interact with each other to produce behaviors or phenotypes. Features of the environment can influence which genes get expressed, that is, which ones get turned on, actually create proteins, and when. So for example, stressful experiences early in life often can change gene expression of the stress hormone for a lifetime, right? So you experience early stress, often that causes changes in the way your genes get expressed. On the other hand, healthy experiences with loving caregivers can often help offset these effects. So even if you do undergo a fair amount of stress early in life, just having supportive people around can often sort of change the effects of that stress. So that's an example of epigenetics. Here's another example that may be a little bit more concrete. Cynthia Beale and her colleagues found that Tibetans, residents of Tibet, had adapted to their environment within, say, the last 10,000 years or so. And I'll give you an example of how. So if you compare the hemoglobin genes of ethnic Tibetans with those of Han Chinese, the Tibetans have lower hemoglobin levels. And these lower hemoglobin levels actually produce or prevent people from getting altitude sickness. So here's a way that this could have happened. So the first step in evolution is called mutation. So for parents to pass genes on to their children, they have to make copies of their genes. These copies end up in egg and sperm cells, which combine to create a fertilized egg that has the full set of human genes. Now, during copying, each one of these chromosomes unwinds and splits in half, as you can sort of see here. Each is then matched up to the necessary molecule to make up the other half using the existing half as a template. So that's kind of what happens typically during sexual reproduction. Sometimes, however, there's an error during this whole copying process, just like you might sometimes make an error in adding an extra letter or something like that to an essay. Often this causes an error, and in genetics this is called a mutation. So at some point, more than 10,000 years ago in China, someone was born with a mutation of hemoglobin that led to reduced hemoglobin in red blood cells. Now normally this would be a bad thing. Hemoglobin binds oxygen and we need oxygen to survive. So usually more hemoglobin is better, and the more oxygen it can carry is better. But in some cases, so for example, when you live at 10,000 feet, you don't want that. So we'll go on to describe this a little bit more here. Natural selection is a pretty simple idea. Some mutations harm individuals. So as a result, they have fewer offsprings. So that offspring would probably die quickly or not have additional offspring, and the mutation would die in the population very quickly. Other mutations, it's very, very rare, but help an individual survive and reproduce. If the person who has such a mutation has more children than average, well then, of course, that mutation will get passed along and become more common than in the next generation. If this process continues for lots and lots of generations, then the original mutated allele actually becomes typical of that particular species. So you can see here that the mutation itself isn't good or bad by itself. It depends on the environment. So the hemoglobin mutation is helpful if you happen to live at a really high altitude. Regions of Tibet are often 10,000 feet above sea level. Oxygen in the air is thin, and people with normal red blood cells will have many hemoglobin molecules that can't bind oxygen. This leads to altitude sickness. So in that way, having less hemoglobin reduces the person's vulnerability to altitude sickness, and that's exactly what happened with Tibetans. The mutation is far more common in ethnic Tibetans than in Han Chinese, whose ancestors lived at lower altitudes. So you can see here that this mutation over time actually ended up being better for them, ended up having led to better health in their particular environment, and as a result living longer and reproducing more. Maybe this is just what I said, but people with hemoglobin reducing allele are more likely to move to higher altitudes. This is called genetic drift. So they were able to go up higher and higher and further away from other groups, and as they did this, then there was more instances of this mutation than existed in lowlands. So the migration of a small number of people and genetic drift, chance factors that led to changes in the concentration of alleles influenced evolution. People with the hemoglobin reducing allele were more likely to move to higher altitudes, which led to greater concentrations in that population. And the effects of migration actually happened at the same time as natural selection. So an adaptation is then a gene-based characteristic held by most individuals in a species or a distinct group due to natural selection. And that seems to be what happened here with these mutations and the ethnic Tibetans.